welcome to Evangelical 360. I'm your host, Brian Stiller, and I'm pleased to share with you another conversation with leaders, change makers, and influencers having an impact on Christian life around the world. We'd love you to be a part of the podcast by sharing this episode using hashtag Evangelical360 and by joining the conversation on YouTube in the comments below. My guest today is Justin Brierley, author and award-winning broadcaster from the UK. In his book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Justin challenges our assumptions that faith in the West is on the decline. Through his examination of the new atheism, he highlights the surprising number of secular thinkers who are considering Christianity once again. How did this come about? And what has reversed the perception that the Christian faith is for non-thinkers? Listen in as Justin shares with us the remarkable story of how the tides have turned. Justin, thank you so much for being with us today. The story of your research and podcast and writing is remarkable. Your book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. How did you come to this conclusion? What were you seeing in your research and your writing?
Secular Canadian psychologist, but who, was not there saying religion's bad for you, but saying actually maybe we need to look at the Bible to find meaning and purpose in life. And then bumping into other similar characters on this side of the pond, people like the historian Tom Holland.
Justin, are there cultural factors that are driving this new interest?
Bringing about the conditions that could catalyze a new interest in Christian faith. And so it's remarkable to me, for instance, that, having sketched out this thesis and the book was published in 2023, suddenly all kinds of factors seem to fall into place that seem to confirm the thesis that suddenly people are ready to hear this again.
Is there any similar pattern, or is there a pattern that you have seen historically where there's a rise of faith, of inclination towards spirituality out of atheism? Or is this a fairly new phenomenon? Justin, is this a more of a personal spirituality movement, or is it an intellectual, philosophical inquiry into the issues of faith, given our new understanding of our global enterprise? Is it a combination of both? What are the demographics of this search? Is it with the Gen Z, or is it in the baby boomers? Where does it rest primarily? My generation was faced the modernity meaning truth can only be defined by scientific methods. It's got to be proven. So we were living in opposition to that kind of modernity and finding a faith over against that kind of scientism. But this new atheism that you describe seems to be something a little different than that. How do you understand that the Gen Z response to a new kind of spirituality, this rebirth that you described, how does that relate to a kind of the modernity, the use of science as a way of defining truth?
the
Is this rebirth leading to a general new interest in spirituality, or does it more specifically focus itself on transcendence, on God or a God? How is this unraveling? So, do you see personal transformation as being an attractive reason for people turning to God or turning to Christ in a specific way? Is personal transformation more than intellectual resolve at the heart of much of this rebirth? How are churches responding to this rebirth? Are they open to the kind of questions that this rebirth is triggering? Or are churches pretty much locked into their ritual and into their form of worship and way of thinking and doing things?
I think the church has to be ready to adapt and to try to do what it can to meet this growing wave of interest and these meaning seekers. But at the same time, a lot of what the church has always done is simply to be ready, ready for when that tide turns, and be faithful and have the doors open and be willing to invite people into the community of the church, where we work this all out together. And that's what I'm seeing. As I say, I've seen a number of churches who are reporting quite interesting upturn in congregation, people walking through the doors, but not because they've particularly done anything strategically different. It's just they're doing what they've always done well, and now people seem to be ready to hear the message.
Justin, are you seeing in this rebirth any inclination towards issues of justice, the issues of poverty, those factors? Does that affect the interest that people have in discovering faith again?
I think there is an important dimension of that, because a lot of, obviously, Gen Z, those are significant issues for them, issues around justice and poverty and so on. And I think sometimes where the intellectual side of that comes in is the question of where do we ground this interest and these values in justice and poverty and so on. And there's been some really interesting conversations I've had with people about who have kind of come up short when it comes to politics being able to deliver, and have realized it's hard to know how to take this forward without getting burned out and stressed out. And I think the church has an important answer to that in terms of how you live as with those issues but do it through the power of Jesus. Having said all that, I think, in all honesty, most of the people I see in this Surprising Rebirth movement, it's the reasons why they're coming to church are more to do with their own personal burnout and the meaning crisis that they've encountered in their own life. And they've tried to kind of adopt the liberal secular kind of values of their culture, or they've tried to do it that way. And it just hasn't worked. And so they're almost coming because they're looking for a better way of structuring their own life. That's the thing that has ultimately driven them to step into a church. So I think it's probably arguably more that personal dimension of what people are looking for that brings them into the purview of the church.
We've seen over the last few years the success of Alpha as a program or as a means of bringing people into conversation on faith. Does this align with the response to the new atheism in the rebirth that you've described?
Yeah, I think Alpha has been tremendously influential. And from what I'm hearing from friends who run the Alpha courses, they're seeing a sudden uptick. There may be churches that have run Alpha for 20, 25 years, but it's really only recently that they're starting to suddenly see a real resurgence of interest. And I'm very grateful for courses like Alpha, which do a great job, in my opinion, of presenting people with the Christian story and giving them the opportunity to talk it through over a meal with people who become their friends. And I think that's one important aspect of this. I think taking people's questions seriously is a really important part of this, giving people the space to work it through and to, there's a lot of confused and messed up people who are going to be coming in on this sort of meaning crisis, this wave, if you like.
How do you see this evolving? You're at the beginning of this rebirth, as you've described. As it moves its way along, what do you anticipate? What are you seeing now?
I'm not a great prophet of these things, and I'm sort of really just trying to keep up with what is happening. What's really interesting to me is that I do think the thesis that I kind of published in my book in the sort of summer of 2023, I've just seen it growing and being confirmed in lots of interesting ways. From all the influencers who are now, showing an interest in faith or converting, to sort of a lot of these surveys and polls showing a renewed interest in faith, especially among Gen Z, and even anecdotal and increasingly, I think, real data to suggest actually that we're seeing a turning of the tide when it comes to church going in the West. There's some really interesting early signs, certainly a stemming of the decline that has been just the story for a long time, certainly in the UK and elsewhere. Where this goes next, there are lots of different ways. There are concerning good directions. I think there's a significant part that's tied into this movement where there are people who have a political axe to grind, who want to arguably co-opt this renewed interest in faith and Christianity for a political agenda. And I think that's one of the areas where the church needs to be very careful in the way that it does this. I was just recently at the ARC conference in London, which is a gathering of very conservatively minded politicians and cultural influencers with a lot of Christians who arguably all have a lot of common cause in some of the things they want to see happen in culture. But I think there is a great danger of this movement, this spiritual awakening being conflated with a kind of conservative cultural project. And we need to be very careful about hitching our wagon, as it were, to any particular political party or movement in all of this. So that's just one area where I see things happening, and I just want to be a voice helping the church to navigate those kinds of complexities.
Justin, speaking to pastors and church leaders, given what you've observed in this rebirth of spirituality, what would you suggest would be helpful in congregational life to serve those that are in search for a spiritual rebirth?
I would say help people to wish that Christianity were true. Let's use the imagination again. Let's lean into that right-brained way of helping people to encounter faith. The way that C.S. Lewis did, who was a brilliant thinker, but also a wonderful storyteller, because the Narnia stories were probably the best way in which he reached people and made them wish that Christianity were true. And that's going to take lots of different forms, but we need to be the storytellers and artists again of the gospel. And so I would encourage churches to do that. And also to embrace the weird, keep Christianity weird is something I've heard from a number of these secular intellectuals showing an interest in faith. They're not looking for a sort of spiritual version of the humanism they already encounter in the culture around us. They're looking for something very distinctive and different, both in the worship, which, they're not necessarily looking for a super seeker friendly version of Christianity. They're looking for something quite mysterious and different to their everyday. And I think they want to be challenged, actually. They want something more rigorous. They don't just want a kind of self-help class when they go to church. They want to be challenged with what it means to be a follower of Christ. And I think that's where you're seeing the most growth, actually, in churches where they do hold out the challenge of Christianity. And I would say, just continue to be at its best what the church always is, which is a community of people who are very different, but gather around something that's bigger than themselves. And that in itself is right now, in a culture which is becoming increasingly fragmented, increasingly dehumanized, where, increasingly relationships are being mediated through technology, and we can't even tell if we're talking to a human being online anymore or not. The church, the gathered church, will become an even more important place for people to find out what it means to be human. So let's keep making sure that happens too.
Justin, thank you so much for being with us today, but also thank you for this important book you've written, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Thanks again, and we look forward to having you again on Evangelical 360.
Thank you so much for the interview. I was really glad to be with you.
Thank you, Justin, for joining us today and helping us see these new movements of faith in our society. And thank you for being a part of the podcast. Be sure to share this episode using hashtag Evangelical360 and join the conversation on YouTube. If you'd like to learn more about today's guest, be sure to check the show notes for links and info. And if you haven't already received my free ebook and newsletter, please go to brianstiller.com. Thanks again. Until next time.
Don't miss the next interview. Be sure to subscribe to Evangelical 360 on YouTube. See you there.